At exactly 9:17 in the morning, a young American soldier crouched in a broken bunker, watching enemy snipers through a scope his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 weeks. They called his rifle a toy. A mail-order sweetheart. Useless for war. But in the next 4 days, that hunting rifle would kill 11 trained enemy snipers and change military history forever. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. At exactly 9:17 in the morning on January 22, 1943, a young American soldier named John George was hiding in the broken remains of a Japanese bunker. He was looking through his rifle scope at a tree 240 yards away. His hands were steady. His breathing was calm. But his heart was beating fast. George was 27 years old. He was from Illinois. Back home, he was a shooting champion. He had won competitions. He knew how to use a rifle better than almost anyone. But here in the jungle, on an island called Guadalcanal, he had not killed a single enemy soldier yet. 0 kills. His record was empty. The other soldiers laughed at him. They made jokes about his rifle. They called it a toy. They called it his mail-order sweetheart because he had bought it himself with his own money and had it shipped to him. The rifle was not a military weapon. It was a hunting rifle. A Winchester Model 70 with a special scope attached to it. George's commanding officer, Captain Morris, told him the rifle was useless. He said it was not a real weapon for war. The other officers agreed. When George had first unpacked the rifle back at their training camp in Tennessee, even the weapons expert had asked him if he was planning to hunt deer or fight Germans. George had explained that the rifle was for fighting the Japanese. But nobody believed it would work. They had good reasons to doubt him. Every other American soldier carried a rifle called the M1 Garand. The Garand was a military rifle. It could fire 8 bullets without reloading. It was semi-automatic. You pulled the trigger, it fired, and it was ready to fire again immediately. George's Winchester was different. It was bolt action. That meant after every single shot, George had to manually pull back a metal bolt, push it forward again, and only then could he fire the next bullet. The Garand could fire 8 times quickly. George's rifle could only fire 5 times, and slowly. The Garand weighed about 9.5 pounds. George's rifle with the scope weighed about the same. But the Garand had no scope. It had only basic iron sights. George's rifle had a Lyman Alaskan scope that could magnify things by 2.5 times. That meant he could see things far away much more clearly. Captain Morris had ordered George to leave his hunting rifle in his tent and carry a Garand like everyone else. George had nodded politely. But he carried his Winchester anyway. Now, 6 weeks after arriving on Guadalcanal, George was finally getting his chance to prove everyone wrong. The Japanese had a serious problem, and that problem was snipers. Let me explain what was happening on Guadalcanal. This island was in the Pacific Ocean. The American military had invaded it in August 1942. The Marines had fought hard battles and captured an important airfield called Henderson Field. But they had not captured the whole island. Japanese soldiers still controlled parts of it, especially the western areas near a place called Point Cruz. In December 1942, the Marines left and were replaced by Army soldiers. George's unit was part of the 132nd Infantry Regiment. They were new to the island. They had first been sent to attack a mountain called Mount Austin. That battle had been terrible. The mountain was 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese had built 47 bunkers and had 500 men defending it. George's battalion attacked on December 17. They fought for 16 days. 34 Americans were killed and 279 were wounded before they finally captured the mountain on January 2. During all those 16 days of fighting, George never fired his Winchester even once. He carried it, but never used it. After Mount Austin, things changed. The Americans pushed west toward Point Cruz. This area was different from the mountain. There were no bunkers. Instead, there were coconut groves and massive trees. The Japanese soldiers had retreated into this jungle. Some of these soldiers were trained snipers. Japanese snipers were extremely dangerous. They had rifles with scopes. They knew the jungle perfectly. They knew how to hide. They knew how to wait for hours without moving. They would climb high into the huge banyan trees before sunrise and sit there all day, completely still, waiting for an American soldier to walk below. Then they would shoot. In just 72 hours, 3 days, Japanese snipers had killed 14 American soldiers. On January 19, a sniper killed a soldier named Corporal Davis while he was filling water bottles at a creek. On January 20, a sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. On January 21, 3 more men died. One of them was shot in the neck from a tree that the patrol had already walked past twice. The sniper had let them pass, then shot one of them from behind. The battalion commander was desperate. His men were dying. Malaria was killing soldiers. The heat was killing soldiers. And now snipers were killing soldiers. He needed someone who could shoot back. Someone who could hunt the hunters. He called George to his headquarters on the night of January 21. He asked George if his mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George explained his credentials. He had won the Illinois State Championship for long-distance shooting in 1939. He was 23 years old at that time, the youngest winner in the state's history. He could shoot 6-inch groups at 600 yards using only iron sights. With his scope, he could put 5 bullets inside a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. The commander gave George until the next morning to prove it. One chance. If George could kill the snipers, he could keep using his rifle. If he failed, he would carry a Garand like everyone else. George spent that night preparing. He cleaned his rifle completely. The Winchester had been packed in thick grease for the ocean voyage to protect it from rust. George cleaned every part of it. He checked the scope mounts to make sure they were tight. He loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition. It was the same caliber bullet that the Garand used, but these were hunting bullets that George had brought from home. At dawn on January 22, George moved to the ruined Japanese bunker. This bunker had been captured by his battalion 3 days earlier. It was west of Point Cruz and overlooked the coconut groves. Intelligence reports said the Japanese snipers operated from the large trees in that area. Some of the banyan trees were 90 feet tall. Their trunks were 8 feet thick. A sniper could climb one of those trees before sunrise and stay there all day without being seen from the ground. The branches and leaves would hide him completely. George brought no helper with him. No spotter, no radio man. Just his rifle, a water bottle, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker and began watching the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan scope had 2.5 power magnification. That is not very powerful by today's standards, but it was enough. It allowed George to see movement in the branches that would be invisible to the naked eye. The jungle was never completely silent. There were birds. There were insects. There was the distant sound of artillery fire from other parts of the island. George had learned to ignore all those sounds. He focused only on movement. He looked at the trees slowly. Left to right. Top to bottom. He examined each tree carefully through his scope. At 9:17 in the morning, he saw something. A branch moved. There was no wind. Just a small shift. The branch was 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George watched carefully. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man. Dark clothing. The man was positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching a trail where American soldiers had been moving supplies. George adjusted his scope. He turned the adjustment knobs 2 clicks to the right to account for the wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was very smooth. George had spent hours adjusting it before the war. The trigger required only 3.5 pounds of pressure. Now he would find out if a civilian hunting rifle could kill a professionally trained military sniper. George squeezed the trigger slowly. The rifle kicked back into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle like thunder. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked violently. Then he fell. His body dropped through the branches. He tumbled 90 feet and hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree with a heavy thud. George worked the bolt action. The empty brass cartridge ejected and landed next to him. He pushed the bolt forward. A fresh bullet moved into the chamber. He kept his scope on the tree and waited for movement. Nothing happened. But George knew the sniper's partner would be close. Japanese snipers always worked in pairs. 1 shooter and 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, then the spotter was somewhere nearby. Maybe in the same tree. Maybe in the trees around it. George began scanning the surrounding banyan trees. The scope's low magnification meant he had to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. The thick canopy created deep shadows that made it nearly impossible to see shapes without careful observation. At 9:43, he found the second sniper. Different tree. This one was 60 yards north of the first tree. The second sniper was lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the first shot and knew his position was compromised. He was trying to escape. George aimed at the moving target. He led the movement slightly, accounting for the sniper's speed. Then he fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. Both the rifle and the man hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots. 2 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This was no different than shooting at competitions back in Illinois. Except here, the targets shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt and sand into his face. George immediately rolled to his left and pressed himself flat against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest. A different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 full minutes before moving. He slowly inched back to his firing position and looked through his scope toward the southwest. The shooter would have moved after taking that shot. That was basic sniper training. Shoot and relocate immediately. But in a jungle this dense, there were limited places to relocate to. George found him at 11:38. Third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyan trees. The sniper was 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch, but he had remained in the same tree. That was a mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion quickly. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now wanted to watch him work. George refused. Spectators would draw attention. Attention would draw enemy fire. The Japanese snipers adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the entire afternoon looking at trees and seeing nothing. At 4 p.m., he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting for him. The mockery was completely gone from his voice now. He wanted George back in position at dawn the next morning. January 23rd began with heavy rain. Thick tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into deep mud and made the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in a bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain stopped at 8:15 in the morning. By 8:45, there was enough visibility to resume work. George spotted the first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. That was smart. The sound of heavy rain would have masked any noise he made while climbing. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards away. Longer range than yesterday. Also smart. The Japanese snipers were learning George's capabilities and adapting. George compensated for the longer distance and fired. The sniper fell. 6 kills total. The sixth kill brought a response George had not expected. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. They had triangulated his position based on either the muzzle flash or the sound of his shots. The first mortar rounds landed 40 yards short of the bunker. The second rounds landed 20 yards short. George knew what that meant. The third rounds would hit the bunker directly. He grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater just as the third mortar salvo hit. The bunker he had occupied moments before disappeared in explosions and flying debris. George relocated to a different position. He found a large fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The tree provided good cover and a clear view of the groves. He settled in and resumed watching. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. Now they were hunting him back. This was no longer just shooting. This was a duel. At 2:23 p.m., George killed his 7th sniper. At 3:41 p.m., he killed his 8th. This one had climbed very high, 94 feet up a banyan tree. Good concealment. But the height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed. George saw it and took the shot. At 5 p.m., Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 hours straight. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 8 hits. 4 misses. Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24. That night, George cleaned his Winchester thoroughly and thought about the mathematics. Intelligence said there were 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead. 3 remained. Those 3 would be the best snipers. The ones who had survived the longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 a.m., he gave up and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15 in the morning. By 5:30, it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used the time to move to a new position. Not the bunker. Not the fallen tree. Somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position. It was a cluster of large rocks that the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and good views into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a light drizzle. Visibility improved. George began looking at trees through his scope. At 8:17 on January 24, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards away. Low position. Only 40 feet up. That was unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sight lines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronds created a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. But George was not at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks. The angle gave him a view down into the fronds. He could see the dark shape of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed carefully. He controlled his breathing. He began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious. Too easy to spot. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He had killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make simple mistakes. They would not position themselves where an elevated shooter could easily spot them. Unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees carefully. If the sniper in the palm tree was bait, then the real shooter would be positioned to cover him. The real sniper would be watching for anyone who took the shot at the bait. He would be waiting for muzzle flash. Ready to return fire. George examined the trees methodically. Left to right. Top to bottom. He checked every tree within 300 yards of the palm tree. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm tree. The sniper was 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was positioned in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there. Or waiting for George to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George had 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him, the sound would reveal George's actual position. The sniper would relocate before George could work the bolt and chamber another round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George was not at the fallen tree. He would begin searching for George's new position. George decided to use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree. He adjusted for wind. Then he fired. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from the palm tree. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it. A slight shift. The sniper was repositioning to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots. 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran. He moved east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. He relocated again, this time to a position 100 yards east. A shell crater that was partially filled with rainwater. George settled into the crater with water up to his chest. He rested the Winchester on the crater rim and resumed watching trees through his scope. 10 confirmed kills. 1 Japanese sniper remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best. The smartest. The most experienced. He had watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning his own attack. George scanned the jungle through his scope. Every dark spot could be a branch or a man. George had to study each one carefully. At 9:47, George realized his mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George saw movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. 60 yards south. Low to the ground. A shape moving through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using the jungle floor vegetation for cover. Ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained completely motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already at his shoulder. His breathing was controlled. But the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot. But rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52. He had reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was studying the rocks carefully, searching for movement, searching for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience was the most important skill of sniper work. The ability to remain completely still. To let time pass. To wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began moving again. He crawled forward. 35 yards from the rocks. 30 yards. 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side, the same side George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. George understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper had watched the machine gun attack. He knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the old machine gun nest and took up a position facing east. He was facing toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater. But he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot. Center mass. 38 yards. An easy shot even without a scope. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers. Men who had been killed because they made mistakes. This man would not make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. This had to be another decoy. Another bait position. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it. Somewhere with a line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier. 70 yards northwest of the rocks. Behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier was not moving, not repositioning. Just watching. Waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He could not shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That would give them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep. They planned to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, completely motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water slowly and silently. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who had been in the rocks. Now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped instantly. George worked the bolt quickly. He chambered another round and swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Voices. Japanese voices. Coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers had not been working alone. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold and muddy. He submerged until only his eyes remained above the surface. He held the Winchester vertically to keep the barrel clear. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. They were moving toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking and equipment rattling. These were not snipers. They were regular infantry soldiers. A patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. George counted seconds in his head. The voices stopped at the location of the first body. 42 yards from his crater. Close enough that he could hear them clearly, even though he did not understand the Japanese words. Then the voices moved to the second body. More conversation. Urgent tones. At 10:28, the voices began moving again. Not back toward the tree line. Toward George's crater. They had found his tracks. Boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement. He had not been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester. At least 6 Japanese soldiers. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options. Stay hidden and hope they passed by. Or fight. The voices grew closer. 30 yards. 25 yards. 20 yards. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. He was looking down directly at George. Their eyes met for a split second. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged. He chambered another round and rose up. 2 more soldiers were at the crater rim, looking down at him in shock. George fired. He worked the bolt. He fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left in the rifle. George could hear shouting. More soldiers moving toward him. He climbed out of the crater on the north side, away from the approaching voices. He ran 20 yards and dropped behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck the ground around the crater and around the fallen tree. The soldiers were firing at movement, at sound, not at confirmed targets. George stayed low. He looked through his scope and saw movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater. 50 yards away. George aimed at the lead soldier and fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left in the Winchester. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking. One group approaching from the south. Another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision quickly. He could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. He needed to break contact and move back toward American lines. George grabbed his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets snapped past his head, struck trees, kicked up dirt. George ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They had not pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock. Water still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no spare ammunition. The spare clips were in his pack. The pack was somewhere near the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George began moving again. Not running. Walking. Staying low. using the terrain for cover. He moved northeast toward the American lines. The jungle was quiet. No voices. No movement. Just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him with his rifle raised. George identified himself. The sentry lowered his rifle and led him through the lines. George walked to battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. Morris wanted a full report. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 11 hits. 1 miss. Then a firefight with infantry. 3 more enemy soldiers killed. 5 total rounds in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action. Water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He field stripped the Winchester and spent 2 hours cleaning every component. He used cosmoline and gun oil. He ran cleaning patches through the barrel until they came out perfectly clean. He checked the scope mounts and adjusted the eye relief. Then he loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 2 p.m., word came down from division headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George immediately. George walked to headquarters, wondering if Morris had filed a negative report. Unauthorized engagement. Excessive ammunition expenditure. Operating alone without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers waiting. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time. And rifles with optics. And men who could already shoot well. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes. Sniper rifles left behind by the Marines. And Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section. Train the men. Develop tactics. Clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted the assignment. But he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request immediately. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes went to the men George would train over the following weeks. Training began on January 27. George assembled 40 men at a makeshift shooting range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper. They had qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards. But none of them had combat experience as snipers. None of them had killed a man from concealment while remaining hidden themselves. George started with the fundamentals. Breathing control. Trigger squeeze. Reading wind direction and speed. Estimating distance accurately. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds with the unertl scopes attached. They were heavier than the Garand. Heavier than George's Winchester. The weight made the rifles stable for accurate shooting, but tiring to hold for extended periods. George taught the men to use any available support they could find. Rocks, logs, sandbags, even their own backpacks. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adapt to whatever terrain they encountered and create stable platforms from whatever materials were available. Range training lasted 3 full days. George had the men shoot at stationary targets from 100 yards out to 400 yards. Then moving targets. Then targets that were partially concealed by vegetation, simulating real combat conditions. By January 30, 32 of the original 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams. Each team had a shooter and a spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand rifle. His job was to locate targets and provide security while the shooter engaged the enemy. After each kill, the roles could switch. This kept both men proficient with the scoped rifle and prevented the single point of failure that came from relying on only one shooter. On February 1, George took 4 teams into the field for their first real mission. Their objective was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikaw River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area. Not organized sniper teams necessarily, just infantry stragglers who had not yet evacuated with the main Japanese force. The 4 teams moved into position at dawn. George paired himself with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply and movement. At 7:20 a.m., a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail below them. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars and gave George the range. George fired. The soldier dropped instantly. George worked the bolt and scanned through his scope for additional targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that same trail. 7 shots fired. 6 kills. 1 miss due to wind that George had not properly accounted for. The other 3 sniper teams reported similar results by the end of the day. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day. 0 American casualties among the sniper teams. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9, the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers total. That number was conservative. It only counted confirmed kills where the body could be directly observed after the shot. There were likely more. The Japanese evacuation from Guadalcanal accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of the island. American forces pushed west to stop the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions that slowed the American advance. George's sniper section was specifically tasked with eliminating Japanese soldiers who were covering the retreat routes. These were dangerous, skilled soldiers who were buying time for their comrades to escape. On February 7, George was operating near the Tinamba River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around violently and knocked him to the ground. Hayes immediately dragged George to cover and called for a medic. The wound was serious but not fatal. The bullet had passed completely through muscle tissue without hitting bone or any major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field within an hour. Doctors at the field hospital cleaned the wound thoroughly and sutured it closed with stitches. They told George he would make a full recovery, but he needed rest and time to heal. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks, possibly longer depending on how the wound healed. George spent 2 weeks at the field hospital recovering from his wound. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9, American forces finally reached Cape Esperance and found it completely empty. The Japanese had successfully evacuated thousands of their soldiers under the cover of darkness. The Guadalcanal campaign was officially over. George's sniper section had operated for just 12 days before his injury ended his participation. 74 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties during any of the sniper operations. The section was officially recognized and commended by division headquarters for its effectiveness. Colonel Ferry personally recommended George for a Bronze Star Medal for his actions. But George's war was far from finished. While he was still recovering at the field hospital, new orders came down from Pacific Command headquarters. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new classified mission. Something in Burma. Something dangerous and important. George volunteered immediately without knowing any details. By March of 1943, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific Ocean. His Winchester Model 70 was carefully packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth for protection. George did not know the specific details of the Burma mission. Yet. He only knew it would involve jungle warfare, long-range patrols deep behind enemy lines, and operations without regular supply support. Exactly the kind of mission where a man with a rifle that could accurately hit targets at 600 yards might prove extremely useful. The transport ship reached India on April 3, 1943. George and 200 other officers were immediately briefed on their new assignment. They would join a new special unit being formed. The unit would eventually number about 3,000 men total. The unit had no official military designation yet. But the men who were joining it had already started calling themselves by another name. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The rifle that everyone had mocked as a mail-order toy had just changed American military doctrine forever. The rifle that commanding officers had called useless and told George to leave in his tent had killed 11 Japanese snipers in just 4 days. The rifle that was supposedly not a real weapon for war had proven that sometimes a truly skilled marksman with exactly the right tool could accomplish what an entire infantry battalion could not accomplish in weeks of fighting. John George went on to train dozens of American snipers who would serve throughout the Pacific Theater. He served with distinction in Burma with Merrill's Marauders. He survived the entire war and returned home. He became a highly respected expert on military firearms and combat tactics. He wrote a detailed book called Shots Fired in Anger that documented his experiences and observations. That book is still in print today and is still studied by military historians, firearms experts, and weapons collectors around the world. His Winchester Model 70 rifle is now permanently displayed in the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Most museum visitors walk past the display case without stopping to look at it closely. To most people, it looks like just any other old vintage hunting rifle from the 1940s. But it is not just any rifle. It is the rifle that proved everyone wrong. The mail-order rifle that killed 11 highly trained Japanese snipers in 4 days and saved countless American lives. The rifle that showed the military that individual skill and the right equipment still mattered even in modern industrial warfare.